Hi, Miss Hicks's class. This is the second half of Danger on Midnight River. Chapter 7. Daniel sat on his heels and watched the water. He had walked downriver for more than 2.5 miles until he found a likely-looking spot at which to cross. He had been watching it for a long time. It didn't look too deep, and the current appeared to be slow enough that he could get across without too much trouble. He thought about the 3 boys back at the camp and how, for a little while, things had been different among them. For the first time he could remember, Daniel had actually felt like part of the group. Then they had turned on him. They had all been asleep when he had silently withdrawn this morning. He had purposely left early so that he wouldn't have to face their empty goodbyes. Daniel looked at the sky. Dark clouds were forming on the east. It would probably rain before afternoon. He smiled. With any luck, he would be halfway home before it hit. Still, he didn't move across the river. He knew he was stalling. His thoughts kept going back to the trio on the mountain. He doubted they even knew how to start a fire. Why should I care? Daniel suddenly stood up and stepped out into the water. He stopped and thought of what his Uncle Smitty would say about leaving 3 helpless boys stranded on a mountain. On the other hand, there's really no rush. Maybe I'll just hang around up there for a while. You and your big ideas. Brandon paused and looked around them. Some shortcut. Scotty, we've been walking for hours, probably in circles. Why do I ever listen to you? We should have crossed the river like Daniel said. Nobody stopped you, Scotty said, breathing hard. You weren't too anxious to swim across the river last night. That's because last night I was dumb and listened to you 2. Daniel knows what he's doing. Didn't you see him? He fed us and kept us dry. Not to mention the fact that he saved Troy's life. Troy sat on a log. Let's take a break. I'm beat. We can argue all we want, but it doesn't help our situation. We're lost. A drop of rain the size of a quarter hit him on the nose. Great, this is all we need. Come on. Scotty led the way through the brush. We need to get under a tree like the one Daniel found before we get soaked. As if on clue, the heavens opened and unleashed a ferocious downpour. Before they could take 10 steps, it was raining so hard it was difficult to see where they were going. The boys crashed through the brush and dove under the first big tree they came to. The only problem was the space under the tree happened to be occupied. The little striped animal stomped its feet and hissed in warning. Then it whirled and in a flash sprayed them with the most foul-smelling liquid. Scotty got the worst of it right in his face. He screamed and ran back into the rain, holding his hands over his eyes in pain. Brandon grabbed Scotty's arm and pulled him to another tree Troy had found a few yards away. They huddled together near the base of the tree while the wind blew sheets of rain at them. They were helpless. There was nothing to do but cover their heads and wait the storm out. Chapter 8. Daniel sat back and took a sip of his rainwater tea. The rain was beginning to let up. When it was clear enough, he would try to pick up the boys' tracks again. Strangely, Brandon, Troy, and Scotty had left the river and cut across the mountain. Their tracks had led him over the top of 2 ridges. There was no telling how far they had gone before the rain hit. He felt edgy. The newspapers were full of stories about backpackers who had lost their way up here. The Premonition Mountains were famous for catching inexperienced hikers unaware. Daniel had never hiked up here. He didn't know these mountains at all, but thanks to the time he had spent with his uncle, he knew there was little chance of his losing his way. He wished he could say the same for Brandon and the others. What are they doing? In the direction they were going, they would never cut across the bridge road. The air was cool, but he was anxious to get started. Taking handfuls of dirt, he doused a little fire. He knew it would be next to impossible to find any tracks after the rain. The best he could hope for was that the boys would continue in the same direction and break off branches here and there, leaving a trail that he could follow. It was slow going. He circled and circled, hoping to find some sign of where they had gone. The noise he was making startled an old doe. She jumped out in front of him and bounded away. Daniel smiled. Some backwoodsman. I'm louder than a herd of buffalo. The doe drew his attention to some bushes off to his right. The bushes had been trampled recently and hadn't had a chance to recover. Daniel pushed some of them aside. Under one was a clear imprint of a tennis shoe, now filled with muddy water. He looked in the direction the boys appeared to be heading. It didn't make any sense. Why would they try to cross the premonitions unless they were lost? If they were, it would make his job even harder. They could change direction at any time. Daniel wondered if he had made a mistake. Maybe it would have been better for him to cross the river and get help instead of wandering around up here. He cupped his hands and yelled for the others. There was no answer. He decided to keep going. If he lost their trail now, he might never be able to find them. When the van didn't show up at Camp Eagle Nest, he figured they would send out search parties. A lot would depend on how wide an area they covered. The searchers wouldn't be able to spot the van in all that at all now. On his trip down river, he had discovered that it had completely sunk below the surface. Anyways, he doubted if a search party would think to look on this side of the mountain range. The more he thought about it, the more he was convinced that the driver had taken them close to 100 miles in the wrong direction. Daniel worked the area carefully. He cut their trail again near an ancient pine tree. The dirt and pine needles under the tree had been packed down. He studied the place where the three boys had waited out the rain and scratched his head. The tree was on the wrong side of a small ravine. They had been sitting facing the wind as it drove the heavy rain in on them. To stay dry, all they would have had to do was move to a tree on the other side of the ravine, or move around to the other side of the tree. These guys are worse off than I thought. They don't even have enough sense to come in out of the rain. From the tree, the tracking became easier. The boys had walked in the mud and left a clear trail. Daniel followed it up a rocky slope. From there, they had taken a 90-degree turn and moved parallel to a rock cliff. Daniel paused at the top of the cliff and looked out. Below him was a sheer drop. In front of him were miles and miles of forest. It was a forbidding sight. The possible urgency of the boy's situation jarred him back to reality. It was getting late, and he still hadn't been able to catch up with them, which meant they would probably spend a cold, sleepless night without food or water. Part of him felt as if they deserved it, but another part remembered the way Brandon had defended him in the van and the look on Troy's face when he tried to thank Daniel for saving his life. He kept going. In Chapter 9. Brandon was awake. He had dozed fitfully, but had been awake most of the night. His t-shirt was still damp from yesterday's rain, and he still had no idea where they were. Slapping his arms to warm himself, Brandon looked at the sky. Come on, son. Scotty squinted up at him. You couldn't sleep either? Brandon shook his head. Too cold. How are your eyes? They still sting, but that's not what's keeping me awake. I'm starving. I've been trying to remember how to get these stupid pine cones to open up, but they won't. Daniel said you have to hold them over the fire, and since we don't have one... Brandon looked around. Where's Troy? Scotty rubbed his eyes. He said he had to go to the John. How long has he been gone? Come to think of it, he's been gone a pretty long time. Brandon cupped his hands. Troy! There was no answer. Come on. Brandon helped Scotty to his feet. Scotty stumbled after him. You don't think he's lost, do you? Brandon just looked at him. Right, Scotty said. Brandon moved along the cliff, yelling Troy's name. Wait. Brandon stopped. I think I hear something. A muffled voice came from below the cliff edge. Help me, I'm down here. Brandon ran to the edge and looked over. Troy, what happened? Troy was sitting on a rock ledge a few feet below. His leg didn't look right. It was thrust out to his side at an odd angle. I stepped wrong and the whole world fell in. I think I busted my leg. Lucky for me, this ledge was here or I'd be a goner. Can you move it? Troy shook his head. Brandon searched for a way down. Though the distance was only a few feet, there wasn't one. Scotty, you hold my feet. I'm going to hang down there and try and pull him up. Are you crazy? I can't hold both of you. You got any better ideas? I do. Daniel stepped out onto the cliff. The boys turned. Relief washed over Brandon. If there was ever anybody I was glad to see, it's you. Scotty squinted at him. Is that you, Daniel, boy? I thought you'd be halfway home by now. And miss all the fun? Daniel looked over the edge of the cliff. How's the weather down there? Troy gave him a half-hearted grin. Don't tell me, you just happened to be in the neighborhood, right? Something like that. Daniel turned. You guys hand me your belts. Daniel pulled his belt off and tied it to the other two and jerked the slack out of them. He handed one end to Brandon. Lay down and hang onto this. Scotty, you hook your foot around the bush and hold Brandon's feet. Holding one end of the belt rope, Danny scooted to the edge of the cliff and lowered himself to the ledge below. One look at the angle of Troy's leg told him it was broken. Daniel shook his head. Some people will do anything for attention, he said. I'd be real happy to share this kind of attention, believe me. Daniel moved around to stand behind Troy. There's only one way to get you out of here. I'm going to help you stand on your good leg, then grab hold of the belt, and Brandon and Scotty will pull you up. Ready? Troy nodded. Daniel bent down, lifted Troy under the arms, and helped him hop to the belt rope. No matter how much it hurts, you have to hang on, okay? You're the boss. Troy took the end of the belt rope in both hands. Daniel motioned with his thumb. He's ready, pull him up. Inch by inch, Brandon pulled. The jagged rocks tore at Troy's flesh and ripped his clothes, but he hung on. When they got him to the edge, Brandon grabbed his arms and dragged him over the lip of the cliff. Okay, now me, Daniel called. He was easy to pull up because he could help with his legs. When he reached the top, he went over to Troy and felt his lower leg. "You really did a job on this. Hang on, I'll be right back." Troy's face was white from pain. "I'll be here." Daniel moved off the rocky slab and found 2 sticks about the same length. He tore a strip off the bottom of his t-shirt and trotted back to where Troy was lying. "This is going to hurt some." Troy gritted his teeth. "Do what you have to do." Daniel straightened the leg as gently as he could. Troy winced and drew a sharp breath. Daniel put a stick on either side of the leg and wrapped them in place with strips from his shirt. "That's the best I can do for now." He tied the last knot, then moved upwind and sat on the rock slab. "I hate to mention this, but you guys really stink." Scotty stepped around Brandon. "We had a little run-in with a skunk last night." "Smells like the skunk won." Brandon rubbed the back of his neck. "We kind of made a mess of things." "I don't suppose." Troy raised himself up on one elbow. "What he's trying to say is, since you left, we haven't even had anything to eat, and we don't have a clue where we are." "How about it?" Scotty said. "Want to get 3 hardheads out of the woods?" Daniel stood up and brushed off the back of his jeans. "If we're going to get out of here, it's going to take all of us." He looked at Troy, especially since Troy has decided he'd rather ride than walk. Chapter 10. Daniel directed the building of a makeshift stretcher. They found 2 long branches and pulled the smaller limbs off. Using their belts, their shoelaces, and strips off their t-shirts, they tied shorter branches across the 2 long ones. Daniel filled in the cracks with pine bogs. He made a mock bow in front of Troy. "Your carriage awaits." Scotty and Brandon lifted Troy off the ground and carefully placed him on the stretcher. Daniel intended to stick to his original plan and cross the river at its slowest moving point. He checked the sun and started back in the right direction. The boys took turns carrying the stretcher throughout the day. Daniel gathered edible grasses and berries, and they ate as they walked. When it was nearly dark, Daniel motioned for them to set the stretcher down under a tree. Troy's face was still white. His eyes were closed, and he was obviously in pain. "Sorry I can't offer you anything to drink." Daniel cleared a place for a campfire. "But tomorrow we'll be at the river, and you can drink your fill." Scotty lay back on the dirt. "I'm done. I don't think I can walk another step." "How long do you think it will take us to get home after we get to the river?" Brandon asked. Daniel blew on twigs and pine needles to start the fire. "It depends on how long it takes us to get across and how far it is back upriver to the washed-out bridge." "I heard something." Scotty sat up. "It's coming from over there." He pointed out into the gathering darkness. "There it is again. Something's in that brush." Brandon sat up. "Bears?" Daniel moved behind the fire and picked up a sturdy round stick. A large brown dog trotted out into the opening. He stopped when he saw the fire and the boys. "Oh, it's just a mutt." Scotty held out his hand. "Here, boy." "Don't call him." Daniel eyed the dog. "Everyone stay perfectly still. Don't give him any reason to come this way." The dog lowered his head and growled. He took a step towards them and hesitated. Brandon cautiously reached for a stick. The dog snarled and bared his teeth. White foam dripped from his mouth. Troy felt around on the ground beside him. His hand rested on a large rock. The dog pawed the ground like an angry bull. He shook his head and some of the white slobber flew off. For a minute, it looked as if he was going to turn around and go back into the bushes. Suddenly, he charged straight for them, lunging at Daniel. Daniel quickly sidestepped and brought the stick around. He nailed the dog in the back of the head, knocking him to his knees. Troy raised his rock and brought it down squarely on the dog's head. The dog didn't move. Daniel stepped closer, his stick still raised. The dog wasn't breathing. Daniel poked it with a stick. "You got him, Troy." "I don't understand." Scotty looked bewildered. "Why did he act like that?" Daniel moved back to the fire. "Rabies." Brandon pointed his stick at the dog. "He could have killed us." Daniel nodded. "If he had bitten one of us, we probably wouldn't have lasted more than a couple days." Scotty was still staring at the dog. "I wonder what he was doing way out here." "No telling." Daniel put a piece of wood on the fire. "He probably made it to this side before the bridge washed out, picked up the disease, and couldn't figure out how to get back." Scotty nervously looked out into the dark. What if he bit something else? He probably did. That skunk that you guys told me about, for instance. Skunks don't usually roam around in the daytime unless something's wrong. A shudder went through Scotty. "This place gives me the creeps. The sooner we get home, the better." Chapter 11. When they reached the river, Daniel made them boil the water before he let them drink it, to eliminate any possibility of contamination from diseased animals. Then they drank until they thought they would burst. After a short rest, they carried Troy downstream until Daniel found the place where he had wanted to cross. Again, Daniel sat and watched the water, searching for any telltale signs of drop-offs or other hidden dangers. "What are you waiting for?" Brandon came up behind me. "It looks okay to me." "You're probably right, but it never hurts to check." Daniel threw a rock into the water. You and I will make sure Troy gets across, and we'll let Scotty worry about the stretcher, okay?" "Sounds like a plan to me." Daniel stood up. "Let's get started." Brandon and Daniel lifted Troy off the stretcher while Scotty slipped it out from underneath him. Scotty wrapped his arm around the first rung of the stretcher and stepped out into the water. He looked at Troy. "All you have to do is float. Brandon and I will do the rest." Scotty shouted at them from the middle of the river. "I'm still standing. It's not that deep. Hear that, Troy?" Brandon patted his shoulder. "Piece of cake." They stepped down into the water. Daniel moved to the lead and put his arms underneath Troy's chin to keep Troy's head up. Brandon stepped to the side to help push Troy through the water. "Sure beats swimming." Brandon looked down at Troy. "We're almost there." Daniel turned to look back at them. As he did, he stepped into a bottomless hole. He lost his hold on Troy and sank below the water. Brandon reached for Daniel to pull him back up. The current grabbed Troy. The upper part of his body was floating away. Troy's leg was useless, so he tried to use his arms to swim. He splashed frantically, trying to get turned around. Brandon snatched at him and managed to hang on to Troy's shoe for a second, but it quickly slipped out of his hand. Daniel broke the surface of the water and gasped for air. He swam wildly in Troy's direction and grabbed the front of his shirt. "Gotcha!" Troy hung on to him. His voice trembled. "I thought you guys said this would be a piece of cake." Brandon helped turn him around. "We lied." Chapter 12. I see it. There it is. The boys had made it to the bank and were following the river back to the bridge. Brandon pointed at it excitedly. We found it, he announced to the others. Daniel and Scotty followed him up a rise. They laid Troy down and walked to the bridge. Now that it wasn't raining, it was easy to see that part of the bridge was missing. There was a gaping hole in the center. The three boys looked over the edge and stared at the swift running water below. It's amazing any of us are still alive. Scotty looked downstream. It's too bad about the driver. I wonder if they'll ever find his body. They'll find him. Daniel stepped back. When we get back, we'll give them the approximate location of the van. Probably hasn't moved that much. It was stuck pretty good. Daniel reached for his end of the stretcher. We better keep moving. It's getting late. With any luck, we could run into a car sometime tomorrow. Scotty sighed and picked up his end. The first thing I'm going to do when I get back is take a long, hot soak in the bathtub. Troy raised his head. I'm going to the hospital. And after that, I'm going to have the biggest cheeseburger in town. I'm going to fall into my waterbed and sleep for 1,000 years. Brandon looked at Daniel. How about you? What's the first thing you're going to do when you get it back? Daniel looked embarrassed. First, I'm going to make sure my mom knows I'm all right. He glanced up at Scotty. She kind of worries about me. Then I guess I'll go home and call my Uncle Smitty and tell him all about our time up here. Scotty shifted the weight of the stretcher. There's something I've been meaning to tell you, Danny boy. Scotty hesitated. All that stuff I said earlier, you know, that stuff on the bus about your mom? Well, I was being a jerk. Me too, Troy smiled, but Scotty was the biggest jerk. You won't get any arguments from me. Brandon thumped both of them on the back of the head. Two tiny lights flickered in the distance. They moved closer. I see it, but I don't believe it. Daniel moved to the center of the road. It's a truck. The headlights grew larger until a light green truck stopped in front of them. A forest ranger stepped out. By the looks of things, I'd say you boys must be the lost campers. Brandon clapped Daniel on the back. Are you kidding? Daniel here knew where we were the whole time. The ranger helped them put Troy in the bed of the truck. Looks like he had a rough time, son. Troy shook his head. Nah, not with Daniel around. He's the one that set my leg. The ranger looked at Daniel. Sounds like you guys were lucky you were along. Scotty stepped up. We probably wouldn't have made it without him. The ranger smiled. That's a reporter from one of the big papers waiting back in town. I'm sure he'll be very interested in how you boys survived the Midnight River. Reporter? Scotty slid into the front seat with the ranger. Did I say we wouldn't have made it without Daniel? What I mean to say was that I was a big part of getting us out alive. Yes, sir, a very big part. Scotty was still talking as he slammed the door. Brandon looked at Daniel and shrugged. So he's still a jerk, what can I say? He jumped up into the back of the truck. With friends like us, you'll always have to stay on your toes. Daniel stepped into the truck bed. He looked through the windows at Scotty, who was still talking the ranger's ear off. Troy and Brandon were discussing what a pain Scotty was. Daniel wasn't really listening. He had stopped at the word friends. That is the end of this book. And I have another one to read to you starting tomorrow.